Yeah, gotta aim for the top like, hold up. Yeah, I can never doubt myself, I know better. All of you critics be acting like you know better. Blowing the smoke, but I know when the dust settles that I'm in my element. It's evident that there's levels to the game.
So what's happening, people? Welcome back to the Athletes podcast. Happy to have you guys back with us once again. And got Reid, co-founder and CEO of Athletes, and myself, Ryan Holmes, here to break down a couple of topics. And full transparency, we're going to make some different adjustments here to the show as we have some more topics. We discuss some things a little bit different with some segments and stuff like that. So hopefully you guys like them. And if you do, let us know. If you don't, tell us that too. But we're going to move forward. And the first thing we're going to do is do some quick hitters. We each have certain things that we're paying attention to that we're not going to discuss in depth, but it's something that we want to at least make sure it's part of the show. And for my quick hitter to start our conversation today, I want to make it, I guess, kind of a shout out and kind of a I told you so type of a thing. Where I want to shout out women's sports in general. And right now we do have the Women's College World Series going on, as well as the Men's College World Series. And I am going to kind of tip my cap, so to speak, to the Women's College World Series. And that is because for the last, I want to say 3 years is what I looked up. The last 3 years, the Women's College World Series has has their viewership tops the men's, and they have outpaced the men's World Series. They're averaging, I believe it's whatever. Look at my notes here. The tournament is averaging 1.1 million viewers across ESPN platforms, which is up 25% year over year. So it's on the upswing even more, even with it, and it's breaking records. ESPN obviously is privy to these numbers, and as they are privy to these numbers and seeing what softball is doing, they up the ante with production, with obviously sponsorship value that comes from the viewership numbers continuing to raise. And they have drones. There's like 40 plus camera productions for this year. The finals numbers aren't out yet as it's still going on. And, we do have a rubber match. Texas Tech and Texas are playing lights out. I know, Reid, you as a Texas alum, you're hooking them very hard right now, watching the women do what they do. But I wanted to make note of this because you are seeing it everywhere, right? Even the WNBA this year, their draft broke records where people wanted to see where's Paige Becker's going? Where are these top level women going to be playing at in the WNBA? And on a separate show, we talked about how there really isn't big market and small market anymore. Your big markets used to be your LA Lakers, used to be your Dallas Cowboys, stuff like that. Those will always be your big click drivers, as that is the, as 90s kids, the Lakers and the Cowboys, and those are the teams that you root for, right? But when you truly look at it, those small markets are gone. And something that Shaquille O'Neal said when he was talking about Giannis Antetokounmpo, I know this is kind of a far reach from Women's College World Series, but it's showcasing that there are no more small markets because of social media, because of marketing, and because of the money that is being put into these efforts, right? So when you put the efforts into these sports, particularly women's sports, as we are seeing, the people start to show up and the numbers start to grow. And we saw that obviously when, Caitlin Clark was in college. We're seeing it now with Caitlin Clark in the WNBA, as a lot of those people, for whatever reason, have followed her, whether it's fanship or just vitriol, have followed her to the WNBA. But the investment into women's wrestling, into women's sports in general, it's starting to pay off. And we're seeing it over these last couple of years with the College World Series, Women's College World Series. And it is truly remarkable to see when you do put the investment there that these things do pay off. So As I said, Reid, I know you as well as our friend Ches, who played for UT softball and has hit some home runs for UT softball and is a good friend of ours, is definitely rooting on for the Horns and wanting to see them make take home a title as they unseated the four-time champ Oklahoma Sooners in the semi. So my quick hitter is, maybe this wasn't as quick as we wanted it to be, but my uh, kickoff topic is investing in women's sports is paying off. We're seeing it in women's basketball. We're seeing it on a lower level in women's wrestling, as there's, I believe 45 states that now sanction high school women's wrestling. And obviously we're seeing it now with the Women's College World Series as they continue to outpace the Men's College World Series and break viewership records this year.
We should have let you go second because that's yeah. It's such an awesome, like, optimistic outlook. I mean, I agree, man. Like, it's electric. I mean, the softball tournament so far has been like required viewing in our household, right? I mean, like
Mhm.
that, just spent a year at Texas Tech, but there is a little bit of love there. And then obviously, spending the lion's share of my time at Texas, I'm obviously personally invested in that. But to your point, I mean, it obviously shows other people are too. And you're right, man. The production value is huge. They've got this new awesome camera out in left field that like tracks home runs and like tracks
Mhm.
outfield balls and stuff. Like it's really fun to watch that sport grow. And I mean, kudos to the teams and to the women involved, like rising to the occasion, man. Like there's no, I mean, I don't feel like there's any slip in anything. Not that we would expect there to be, but like, man, like it's just another sort of proving ground of like, look, if you give us the opportunity to show you how cool this can be, we'll show you how cool this can be. And for softball being such a quick sport, in my opinion, as a baseball player, and a lot of reason why I think a lot of people struggle to watch that sport long term, it's a blast, man. I've loved it. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of the money involved in some of that stuff later in the segment, but the reason why I said we should have let you go second is because my quick hitter is a bit of a bummer compared to that. More maybe just something on the horizon or something. But something that I think I've been trying to keep up with, or at least kind of had an eye on here the last, I don't know, couple weeks or so, something like that, is another piece of governance policy, whatever you want to call it, coming through the Division One layers that, in my opinion, would be page one news if House wasn't doing what House was doing and taking
Mhm.
forever and bringing us all the way up to the very, very end of this July 1 start date it's supposed to have. Basically, what has been proposed at the Division One level is a new governance policy or new governance structure that would essentially create voting on a board level as opposed to voting on a member level. And what that means is, based on the way the board is structured, essentially the Power Four conferences would get almost 70% of the voting power for Division One and Division One changes. And so if this goes through, theoretically, you're basically telling everybody who isn't in the Power Four in Division One that we don't care about your opinion and we're going to make decisions that fit us, the Power Four, and not you, everybody else who doesn't have the $200 million operating budget that an LSU or a Texas has. And so that means a lot of things. That could mean a lot of things. We could sit here and spend an entire episode speculating on what that might look like, but that's not our topics for today. So we're going to let it sit and see what happens. But I do think it's something that people should at least be aware of. Like that is something coming down the pipeline, whether or not this House v NCAA thing does whatever it does. This is another lane and another angle at the Division One level that we need to keep an eye on because if it passes, it really does have the potential to drastically change opportunities, seats, rosters, all sorts of different things at the Division One level. So, um, that being said, it's a really good transition into our first topic that we have today, which, Ryan, I know you've been kind of hitting the grindstone on, and you're going to help kind of educate me a little bit more on sort of what we're looking like today. But, how are schools handling these changes at the NCAA level right now, specifically as it pertains to, the looming House approval that we all kind of expect to happen, despite the fact that Judge Wilkins is taking her time, understandably so, thanks to the NCAA's lack of solutions that they've provided her.
Yeah, there's a lot of different avenues that schools are taking when it comes to the changes at the NCAA level with this looming House versus NCAA case, which we had thought, and if you go back at this point, it seems like 10 episodes ago, we had thought would be done by now, right? And she has continued to delay it and delay it and delay it, mostly because it's just not good enough. And they're not giving it the right credence. They're basically not giving her the right answers. So she's like, no, come back, do it again. Right. So I I have to give her credit for that because she is making sure that the student athlete is at the forefront. And student athlete was obviously a term coined by the NCAA, which we have now found out had way more nefarious kind of allocation to it, right? And credence to it because they were trying to keep them as student athletes, or at least have the facade of them being students first, even though they put way more millions and billions into what they do as non-students than what they do as students, which we can see with TV levels and or TV rights deals and sponsorship and everything else. Um, but when it comes to how schools are handling the changes that are happening now or that are potentially happening in the future, we've seen a number of different things. And the first thing that we caught on to was the St. Francis University in PA changed from Division 1 to Division 3, or at least they're going to be making that change in 2026, where they're no longer a Division 1 school, and they've made that change because of the money factor that goes into it, and that being, that in and of itself of what they would have to spend and what they don't have to truly spend is what pushed them into, being a Division 3 school, right? Now they're not the only school. They're the only school that has done this in recent news. But there has been other schools that have done, at least one other school that has done it. Hartford did it in 2021, going from Division 1 to Division 3, and they also cited financial concerns when it came to why they made the move. There isn't, St. Francis didn't say that this was a financial move. So none of that kind of came with their announcement to move from Division 1 to Division 3. But if you're reading the tea leaves and saying, okay, you're a Division 1 sport, you either opt into this new rev share model, and now you have roster limits, and now you have all these other things that you didn't have in the past, and you have to essentially restructure your entire athletic program, it certainly changes things for you. So instead of having to overhaul everything that they're doing, it is much easier just to reclassify and keep things as they were and compete at a different level, instead of, enduring the financial hardship of what they were doing. So that is one way of going about it. And before I get into some of these others, I want to hear your thoughts on, do you feel like this trend will continue? Like we'll see more schools that take this route?
It's interesting because I'm kind of, to your point, I was surprised that St. Francis was the only school that basically came out outright and said, "Hey, we're not playing this game. Like we're going to move
Mm-hmm.
down to D3 and we're just going to live our lives and have a time." I wonder how many schools are taking the approach of like, well, let's just see what happens. Like let's give it a season or two. Let's create a 5 year trajectory pathway or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
With the idea being, we can opt in a little bit, maybe we don't opt in and we see how competitive we are. Maybe we see if the benefits of Division 1 are still paying off for us and then sort of adjusting at that point. Because I do think you've seen, there are schools that are at that Division 1 level that are preemptively dropping sports, for example, right? We saw Grand
Yes.
Canyon the other day drop their men's basketball or men's volleyball team despite being, fantastic, right? We saw University of Utah recently drop women's beach volleyball. So you have these teams at the Division 1 level that are dropping sports. And maybe that is kind of that preliminary sort of prep of like, okay, we think we can now manage financially if we get rid of this, if we get rid of that, which of course brings in the larger conversation of like, what the hell are we doing? Like the whole point of
Mm-hmm.
this is to like create access and opportunity for kids. And like, if you're just going to want to spend more money on football, why are we killing beach volleyball? Why are we killing men's volleyball to do these
Exactly.
things like that? Obviously, that's a big issue, but I think it's going to be interesting to see how the different schools I still think, despite the fact that everyone's, we're locking in, we're committing to this, I think within the first 3 years of this whole test run, basically, we're going to see schools make some drastic changes. I think you are going to see schools eventually jump down to Division 3. I think you are going to see, unfortunately, massive changes in sports that are sponsored versus sports that convert to club and things like that. I just don't know. I mean, you look at the money, I just don't know how many schools can keep up with that. And the other thing that sort of comes in from the other angle, admissions wise, is that we're about to hit an enrollment cliff. We have a sizable population drop in college age kids coming up here in the next 1 to 3 years. And I don't think a lot of schools have, I think they're aware of it, but I'm not sure a lot of schools are wholly aware of how that's going to affect them specifically because they don't know where they fall in the market, right? If we
Mhm.
lose X percentage of kids that are willing to go to college in general, how many of those big schools are going to pick those kids up and retain those kids? And how many of these schools down here that are smaller and or less known outside of a local or regional area, how are they going to be able to compete in that market for those kids in general? So I wonder how all of that's going to come together. But to be honest, I don't think we're done seeing this thing sort of mesh, at least until 2 or 3 seasons into this whole thing, once it finally gets approved. That's my take on it.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, to your point about schools being looking to drop sports, the Olympic sports are normally the ones that are on the chopping block in that regard, and something that the community that I'm part of, the wrestling community, very upset right now because Cleveland State is essentially dropping their wrestling program along with a number of others. And I believe there's maybe one other school that's going to be doing the same, but the big headline behind that is that Cleveland State's president just got a raise. So the craziness around, well, we're going to opt into rev share and we're going to drop sports to opt into rev share, but then our top administrator is going to be getting a raise of like $125,000 or something like that. So it's it's pretty insane. But the other avenues that schools are taking, so UMass is changing some things as they prepare. They've already allocated about almost 6 million for athletes in 2025 and 2026, with plans to increase that to 8 to 10 million the following year. Um, so the allocation of money is already happening. Like I said, it's happening with UMass. It's also happening with schools like Georgia, LSU, Texas Tech, who we talked about with the women being in the softball World Series championship finals. Obviously, their pitcher, first of its kind, the $1 million NIL deal. So things like that are already starting to be kind of pushed and changed, and you're starting to see them pay off. But these schools, like I said, Georgia, LSU, Texas Tech, they've already allocated that $20.5 million that is supposed to be coming in this House versus NCAA case of what can be allocated to these sports. And it's already been allocated for football and basketball players. So they're already prepared to do these things. And that is unsurprising of schools that are that large that do have these big sponsorship deals and are playing under the biggest and brightest lights when it comes to specifically football. When you look at Georgia, LSU, and Texas Tech, where Patrick Mahomes went, right? So you can certainly see that the efforts are already there to change these things and make the necessary changes where they need to. Um, so in that regard, it's unsurprising. But you also have to look at the giant that is making these changes. As I said, Georgia have played in how many national championships in football in the last couple of years, right? They have been at that national championship level. LSU also won a national championship in football in the last, what, 5 to 10 years, right? Like, these big power schools and power conferences are making power moves because they can right now. And that's how they're responding. That is how they are handling all of these things. It's not as drastic as changing from Division 1 to Division 3, but it's actually, I should take that back. It's probably more drastic when they're able to allocate that 20.5 million off the bat for these caps than it is to change your division. And in that same vein, just this year, at the beginning of the year, the NCAA changed their reclassification kind of rules around that, where you're paying a hefty bit to reclassify from Division 3 to Division 1 or from Division 3 to Division 2. They're trying to make sure that the schools that are less competitive, and I'm putting this in air quotes for those that aren't watching on YouTube, the ones that are less competitive on that Division 3, Division 2 level don't think that they're big enough to come up to that big boy level of Division 1. So they're basically making it impossible, because if they start to have a lot more shifting going on from Division 3 to Division 2, things are going to change drastically on that conference level. And we're already seeing conference realignment that's going along with this Division 1 to Division 3 level of alignment, as well as the rev share and everything else that you want to throw into this huge pot of NCAA gumbo that is ever changing every single day. So, lots of different types of responses to this. The last one is on more of a, I guess, political level, where Texas is, they passed a law which allows colleges to directly pay athletes for their name, image, and likeness. And that was, recent. And they had to do that because if not, they weren't going to be Texas. And then you saw how Texas football was at the top of the line, or at least close to the top of the line, when it came to NIL spending. And the only thing that I haven't seen is whether or not Texas specifically, and it's something that I want to dig into, has changed those rules for high school athletes. Because part of the reason why Quinn Ewers spent a redshirt year at Ohio State is because he couldn't stay in Texas and collect NIL money as a high school athlete. He decided to reclassify, go to Ohio State, collect that money from Ohio State in NIL, basically played, I want to say, like 2 or 3 downs of football while he was at Ohio State. I said, okay, now it's time for me to go back home, now that my spot has opened up and I've done the development that I needed to do. So the high school level, I don't know if it remains unchanged at all, but I know that within Texas where we are, they have made changes so that they can pay those players, and that obviously happened as NIL was taking shape, but they had to pass laws in order for this to fully take shape. And that, I bring that up because I feel like other states are going to look to allocate laws and governance to things that are coming out of the NCAA.
Yeah, I think it was like 5 days ago or something, or what. So Texas, their new legislation basically is you now as a 17-year-old can engage in NIL activity. And I think exactly to
Bingo.
your point, Ryan, it was to prevent melt effectively from kids going, oh, well, I'll just go over to Missouri. I'll move there for a year and I'll make my money and then I'll do XYZ from that point or whatever. So I do think it was is intended to kind of retain some of that talent in the state and kind of stay competitive. But it is so as it is with all of these things, right? I mean, it's almost like, okay, we've gone ahead and monetized the college age kids. Now let's just move it down one. Now let's just
Mm-hmm.
make sure we cover the high school kids. So who knows how far that snake is going to go as we start to talk about it. It felt a little bit crazy to talk about NIL with college sports 2 or 3 years ago, and we might be
Yeah.
sitting here on this podcast here in a couple of years talking about, the Dallas Stars elite hockey team and, the 8U to 12U elite team getting incentives or whatever. It sounds ridiculous when it comes out of my mouth right now, but so did a lot of things a couple of years ago whenever we talked about it. So who knows, man? Yeah, it's something that we got to keep an eye on.
I mean,
But
as ridiculous as that sounds, not to cut you off, but as
no,
ridiculous as
no.
that sounds, I saw earlier this week a 6-year old. They created a graphic, and I'm telling you, this was real. I looked into it, so this was not parody. Created a graphic for a 6-year old Pop Warner football player who said he was entering the transfer portal. I do not know where he ended up. I don't know where he signed or anything else like that. I have no idea. I didn't. I don't know. Maybe it's going to be on ESPN later on, where he's announcing he's taking his talents to South Beach like LeBron. But I'm obviously making fun of it because it is wildly stupid. We don't need to make graphics for 6 year olds. We don't need rankings for 6 year olds. We don't, no, there has never been a kid that has been recruited at a Pop Warner football game or at a little league softball or baseball game. It doesn't happen. These aren't things that are real. And it's probably to our third topic of parents thinking that they know what's best and they want to make these kids grow up a little quicker or give them some experience that they don't need right now, right? So um yeah, you said ridiculous things, and that popped in my head of as I was doing some doom scrolling on Twitter and just seeing what the current events were the other day. I saw that they had announced that a 6 year old was in the transfer portal.
That's that's amazing. And we should come back to that in topic three because that
Yeah,
it's amazing in the purest form of the word, I guess. It truly it fills me with amaze. I
it
it I
yes,
Gee,
yeah, it
oh my
does.
gosh.
Um,
Well,
yeah,
let's
you're
pop
right.
over to topic two here. So the other thing that we were going to sort of talk about is kind of what I wanted to bring up specifically was sort of the economics of the baseball and the softball tournaments. There's a publication called Extra Points that I pay quite a bit of attention to and I love. And they went through and kind of pulled public records for all of these teams that were competing in, I believe it was the super regionals for could have been the regionals as well, but I know certainly the super regionals for softball, and then the regionals for baseball, just to kind of see, okay, what are the operating budgets of these teams that are playing in these tournaments against one another? And I found that interesting because so many times, understandably so, we end up talking about football and we talk about men's predominantly and women's basketball
Mhm.
as sort of holding the lion's share of this money that exists in the college space. And that 100% is true. But I think it was interesting to see the economics of the baseball and softball tournaments, really even in context of just like what are the general operating budgets of these programs and what have they sort of built up within their own athletic departments to justify cost-wise, and then how is that affecting the overall competitiveness? And so I just wanted to kind of highlight a couple of ones that I had seen in there that were really interesting. So to be clear, when we talk about operating budgets in this sense, we're not talking about NIL deals. So we're not talking about the money actually paid to athletes. So keep that in the back of your head. That money is separate from the money that we're
Mhm.
talking about right now. The only one that's a little different is Najari Canaday. I do want to bring her up for Texas Tech because their operating budget is about half of what Oklahoma's operating budget was. Oklahoma operated at about 6 million, and I think, oh no, I'm sorry, it was six. So uh, Texas Tech was operating about $1 million. Oklahoma was operating about $6 million. Texas is operating about $3 million. And so you have these huge disparities in operating budget for these teams. But then you throw in Najari, and she's got $1 million deal with Texas Tech. And so
Yeah.
even if you add that to it, we're still sitting underneath Texas and OU as far as competitiveness is concerned. But Najari's a wagon. So I mean that you
Yeah.
talk about like money spent and investment spent. I mean, good Lord. Like she's probably if she throws again tonight and wins, like Texas doesn't deserve to win. You know what I mean? Like that's just crazy to throw three
Mhm.
games in a row and then also carry the whole thing. Like that's just unbelievable. But again, you look at that and you see, okay, Oklahoma is their budget is double the next most competitive softball team. And then we all look up and wonder why it was that they did a four-peat a little bit ago on the national
Yeah.
championship. And like, don't get me wrong, Patty Gasso and all the people there, they have proven that that money's well spent whenever they put it in that program. That I mean, I don't know what deal she made with who, but it's unbelievable. Like
Yeah.
she's getting her money's worth, but it's obviously earned them up into a spending budget in Norman that other teams don't simply have. And I think you've seen that more one to one on the softball side. And then on the baseball side for the regionals, obviously, big programs, more money. Traditionally, that's gonna work. I just found it really interesting. So Murray State is the only baseball team with a budget under $1 million, operating budget under $1 million, that made it to a super regional. They're at about 850K, and had to by the skin of their teeth beat Ole Miss on a third game. Tried really hard to give it away at the end and managed to pull it out. But everybody else has an operating budget of over $1 million who's competing at a super regional, which we talk about this money in college sports, like it's all just, oh, it's money. It's not a big deal. You go talk to an admin about $1 million annually to have to allocate to any team. That's an investment, man. That's money that they got to spend. And so to your point, these big programs that can shell that out are able to sort of compete. And then you have your Murray States of the world who aren't quite at $1 million, but 850 isn't anything to scoff at.
Yeah.
That, I mean, you get into the super regionals and they are the Cinderella story so far. We're going to see what happens this weekend in the super regionals, but they are the team that everyone should be paying attention to from that perspective. The other one I wanted to point out was UTSA. So UT San Antonio, a system school of UT, my alma mater. UT has 10 times the operating budget, not including NIL money, 10 times the operating budget of UT San Antonio. And UT San Antonio beat them in their own regional that UT
Yeah.
hosted to move on to the super regional. So I'm sorry, we have two Cinderellas that we need to talk about on the baseball side for super regionals. But again, it's just this whole like when you look at the numbers and the disparity of spending between these programs, it just is it's fascinating to me. I think we forget that yes, obviously the lion's share of that money is going towards football, men's basketball, women's basketball. All of these sports take quite a bit of money to operate on an annual basis. That's why they're always sending out fundraisers. They're always trying to sort of fight for more cash or whatever it might be. And it's hard to, I mean, you see that make a difference in what kids are able to do. Like there's a have money will succeed is kind of how it comes out on that. But I just found it interesting. We always get to look at other sports and finally baseball and softball kind of have their moment in the sun right now for the end of May and beginning of June. And thought it'd be kind of fun to just sort of compare some of those programs against one another.
Yeah, it's super interesting to me for a number of reasons, right? So looking at operating budgets and seeing what teams are, how they're spending their money is always going to be interesting. And that's outside. I mean, I think the most interesting spending of money is obviously NIL money. Everybody wants to know who's got this deal, who's got what deal, how much money. I mean, I think they talked about Cooper Flag play basketball at Duke. 28 million in contracts in NIL last year, right? So that was a headline for most of the week. So NIL is obviously the top of the heap when it comes to collegiate spending. But when you look at what it takes outside of that spending of just paying players in this new world of college sports, the aspects of what is needed to keep the train on the tracks is always going to be interesting because, as you said, Murray State, 850K, UTSA, very low operating budget compared to UT, which is 10 times what theirs is, right? So like seeing how all of these schools continue to progress and everything else is reminiscent of a lot of the old school aspects of sports where the teams that were your old school, play on a dirt gravel type of field and, only have, maybe 5 basketballs for the team or, the team has to buy their own cleats, which as a D3 player, I had to do, things like that where it's kind of stitched together. Right. And obviously, like I said, and you said the same thing, 850K is not a small operating budget by any means, but in comparison to these top of the line, big time schools specifically that are in the SEC, the money it's not equal at all. So it showcases the fact that the operating budgets in essence aren't always the differentiating factor. It's always going to come down to the support system and the systems that have been set up for these players. And again, not speaking of NIL, I'm speaking of coaches, trainers, facilities, stuff like that. That is, even though I'm sure UT has a phenomenal facility compared to basically any school in the country, the facility didn't much matter when people were picking up the bats and starting to swing them. And UTSA showcased that. Murray State showcased that by making it as far as they have. So, this topic obviously goes into what I started the show off with today is the numbers on the softball side are phenomenal when it comes to viewership and in this day and age, viewership is what kind of trumps everything. Viewership is king in a lot of these ways. Clicks are king. Everybody wants to be the team that says we have the attention of the community. The community has to come to us if they want these things. And the viewership as well as the operating budgets at these schools, they go hand in hand. Don't think that they don't. They certainly go hand in hand because the operating budgets are propping up the systems around these players. These players are able to go out and perform, and when they go out and perform and they're enticing to watch, the viewership goes up, the clicks go up, the headlines start to multiply. So it is a bit of a follow the money type of factor, but it's certainly real, and we're seeing how these things are transpiring right in front of us. Everything is unfolding out in the open. There is no cloak and dagger anymore when it comes to, at least I shouldn't say no, but there's a lot less cloak and dagger when it comes to the NCAA sports.
Well, and I think as we're kind of talking about it, it's making me sort of reminisce on the fact too of things that we mentioned in the previous topic of like, man, I love that I get to like Murray State. Didn't really even think about them until
Yeah.
2 weeks ago. Not that they're not a great school, not that it's not a wonderful institution. I don't live near that. I'm in Texas. I know my regional places. I focus on those things. Obviously, I've got the teams that I cheer for. I'm so much more invested now in the super regionals of baseball because I have a Murray State and a UTSA and these teams that quote unquote shouldn't be here because the budgets don't line up or the NIL money doesn't line up or whatever it is. There's still this opportunity for us to kind of find that beauty in sport and find those narratives in sport. And to your point, we talk about content, we talk about clicks, we talk about views. In my opinion, this is a lot of what drives that at the college level. If you wanted to see the best of the best of the best of the best, watch the NFL, watch the NHL, watch the MLB. Like that's where you're going to really find that. And I think what sort of separates college sports fans from professional sports fans or what those levers are that separate your interest in those two sports. For me, college, so much of it comes down to the fact that you can have these moments and you can have these
Mhm.
teams. And we've created at least enough of an equitable playing field at those certain divisions that schools have an opportunity to kind of quote unquote pull themselves up by their bootstraps and kind of do things they wouldn't otherwise do. And one of the things that I get nervous about and that we've talked about, and we saw it a little bit on the basketball side, is like, what do we are we losing that if we kind of start to separate these budgets and expand it to such a degree that it can't happen, right? I mean, same with softball. I love you've got Texas that has been trying to win this dang thing for the last 10 years, it feels like. You have Oklahoma who's finally unseated as just the unequivocal champion. Not to say they won't probably be back there next year, but like they don't have a chance to win it this year. So that really drives that in. You have Najari who's doing what she's doing, and that's, bringing this team up that has never been to a College World Series final before and just essentially carry. I mean, team's great, I'm sure, but she's carrying that,
Yeah.
whole program up through the roots. Um, that's the kind of stuff that's fun to watch. And so I guess I hope and I opine that we're going to be still have that when this is all said and done and things kind of shuffle out.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say on it before we move to our last topic is the investment that is happening is you're starting to showcase, it's starting to be showcased on many levels. And I mentioned that this resonates for multiple reasons before. One of the other reasons that operating budgets and things like that were resonating with me because I've been to OU. I've seen their facilities. I've been in their facilities. And one of the questions that I asked, because and I wish I had my OU jacket on that I got from there, but they, when you're there, you're there as a journalist, and we were there covering the wrestling team and doing a trip with the wrestling team, and they give you really cool gear, and you get very different gear from different places. And over my 15 years being a journalist, I have a lot of stuff. But the one that at OU sticks out to me because as we're on our way there, I get a text from the coach and he's like, who's coming with you? One, and two, give me everyone's t-shirt size, their sweatshirt size, their jacket size, their shoe size. Like, give me all their sizes. And I'm like, okay. And mind you that I've been, like I said, been on trips. Arizona State was another trip that was kind of similar where, we were out on a tour and shooting some video. We came back to the wrestling room. There was stacks of stuff there. OU set up lockers for myself and Mike, who was with me, with shoes, with jackets, with sweatshirts, with all these different things, all OU, to give to us, to thank us for being there and showcasing their program, showcasing their school. OU obviously didn't need us to do that because it's still OU, but the wrestling program certainly enjoyed it, right? So, but you're seeing what they're able to do where they're saying, hey, and they set up lockers for us as well. Like they were all set up as if we were arriving for game day, right? So they rolled out that red carpet. And one of the things that I asked of, as you can see over to my left, partially the sneaker rack that I have for people that are watching on YouTube, but I am a Nike sneaker guy. Not say I don't have other pairs of different brands, but Nike is a pretty heavy brand in my collection. And one of the questions I asked was, hey, I know you guys have a Jordan deal. What is it like to be on a campus to have a Jordan deal? And I asked the same thing at UNC as well. And they said, well, for us, and they're speaking of the wrestling team, we're not part of that deal. That deal is reserved for football, basketball, and softball. Those are the only three on our campus that get uniforms that have the Jordan logo or that get anything that have the Jordan logo. And they're like, we can't even get it as coaches, right? Like we can obviously buy it, but it's not something that we can order or something that we can do. So, like I said, when you start talking about operating budgets and you start talking about how much money is going into these things, I start to think of also the sponsorship deals and the different deals and things that go into it. And that story of being on campus at OU and seeing the facilities and seeing all of these different things and being in the weight room and talking to the coaches about just the access that they have to everything on the campus. However, unless you are part of their elite programs, you're not getting the top of the line elite type of offering. Where, like I said, softball being the champions that they are, 4-time champions, and I mean, I should say 4 times in a row. They've won more than 4 championships, but 4 times in a row. And at this point, this was, I want to say 2017, maybe 2018. So things were different on that campus than what they are now. But that's what they said. That Jordan deal is reserved for these set of teams, right? So it may be a far cry from their operating budgets, but it also showcases what these schools are doing in order to really further things. And the last thing is on this economic, kind of the economics behind baseball and softball. I want to go back and speak on softball. We saw recently how the MLB is investing in softball and how they are going to now have, I mean, there already is a professional softball league with Athletes Unlimited, but the MLB is seeing, and what Manfred actually talked about is how the momentum of women's basketball in the WNBA is what they're seeing. So they want to capitalize on that when it comes to women's sports and make sure they are pushing in women's sports and making the investment in women's sports. So as I started the show off with talking about the investment in women's sports and how viewership is being showcased, and now we're talking about the operating budgets and how there's, Najari has her $1 million deal, and it was first of its kind in softball. You're now seeing, this is kind of a follow the money episode of where we're going to next. And now there's more money being invested into softball in the professional ranks, where there already is a professional league with, I believe, 8 teams or so. And now there's going to be even more of an investment and development with the MLB saying, okay, the NBA has their sister league, we need ours. And they're going to inevitably have that. So for me, that's super interesting. Reid, do you have anything else to say on this topic before we move to the last one?
No, I think we've covered everything that I can possibly cover on that. But this next
Yeah.
topic, I certainly have some opinions on.
Yeah, and it goes back to the conversation we had with Dan Chamberlain. We were talking about youth sports with Dan, and Dan gave us incredible insight. And we posted a lot of clips and things. I love the the intrinsic versus the external motivator conversation that we had during that. But this last topic is about helicopter parents, and in that conversation with Dan, we talked about certain things like this. But the one of those things that stood out was how he said that at some point we decided as adults that kids organizing themselves to play a game was no longer sufficient. And mostly because there were obviously kids being left out and they didn't want kids to be left out. So they decided to come in over the top and regulate these things. And now when you look at, and that's most likely being left out of the Sandlot games, not so much the structured youth sports, but they moved from the Sandlot into structured youth sports and said, we want to have this type of experience for our kids. We know what we had when we were in college. Maybe if we take the training and the knowledge that we had as kids or as adults or as players on the college level and start to give it to the kids at the Pop Warner level, the youth level, they'll be further along than we were when we get there. The problem with that is that you're not the only parent that is thinking of this. That is happening everywhere. And as I go back to a number of times on the wrestling level, I see this because your Olympic champions are now in the same rooms with your up and coming kids that are at the youth level. And your Olympic champions are coaching their kids that are at the youth level. So they're getting higher levels of training, but it's very different than being a helicopter parent where they aren't, where like we said, it goes back to that sandlot of kids being left out and parents not wanting to have their kid have a bad experience on the playground and wanting to structure that. Reid, your thoughts?
You know, I agree with you. I really enjoyed Dan's perspective on this and him coming from, a youth sport background, being in the trenches. It was really interesting to hear his
Mm-hmm.
space on this. I think what always shocks me, and I even see it with high school kids that I'm working with, right on the consulting side and speaking with them, man, their brains are different than ours. Like, I think so much of it comes from parents will sort of see kids at any level either engaging in play, engaging in sport, engaging in whatever. And I think that parents have this idea that, okay, this kid needs to experience this in the way that I would interpret it as fun or challenging.
Mm-hmm.
And that just isn't the case for a 7-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 9-year-old, a 15-year-old. Like there's different standards of what satisfaction looks like in those spaces. And I think you have to be willing to give kids the space to figure out what that looks like for them and what it is and how they want to be involved. If you teach somebody how to think and how to work and how to act and how to approach something for so long, if that doesn't align with that kid's base principles or that kid's base interests, like you're just going to start burning that wick at both ends. And I think that's where you see a lot of that chafing and a lot of that burnout that we find is that kids have this understanding that they have to engage in sport or engage in something that they enjoy in the way that their parent wants them to engage in it. And I
Mm-hmm.
think anybody who has been around a child, has a child, aunt, uncle. I mean, it's almost as if the second you tell somebody how to enjoy something or how to have fun, it loses that sparkle in there, right? It just, for whatever reason, it doesn't allow you to kind of explore things the way that you want to explore it. And so it's this irony because I think 99 times out of 100, parents take this approach because they love their kids so freaking much. Like they
Mm-hmm.
want to give their kid every possible opportunity. And from their point of view, they're thinking, okay, my kid's got a bit of a knack for this. This is a pathway for them to have success, whether it be in college or life or whatever. We're going to really lean into this thing hard. We're going to do everything we possibly can to put this kid in a position to succeed at this thing. And what that inherently does is it just pigeonholes that child to say, okay, you're 6 years old, you have a bit of a knack for this thing. This is who you are now. This is your identity. This is your value and your characteristic to the family. No parent goes into this process with that being their mindset. But when you get to 11, 12, 13 years old, and the only things you can talk about when it comes to your kid is what team they play on, how many tournaments they've won, what their UTR is in tennis, what their state ranking is in wrestling. Like with that's the only if you find yourself quantifying or speaking about your child through that lens only, how do you think that kid feels, man? Like that's a lot of pressure for a kid or for a teenager to say, okay, I guess my value in this family stems from what I'm doing in my sport. So if I'm not succeeding in that sport, what value do I bring to my family? And if I'm not bringing value to my family, what am I doing here? And that's that spiral that we see so many kids get to. So even when I talk to kids, when they're 14, 15, 16 years old, the number of kids that I work with that hit 16, 17 years old, they've gone through this whole process, they're going through the recruiting process, and finally they just basically build up the courage to tell me, like, I don't like this as much as everyone says I like this, but I feel like I
Yeah.
have to do this.
Yep.
Like, is there something else I can be involved? Can I do this in a club capacity? Can I do this intramural? How do I talk to my parents about not wanting to do? I mean, like, that's what it sort of builds itself to, and we see it over and over again. And so, it's this weird catch-22 where you kind of have to encourage parents to, like, you have to be the adult in the room. As ironic as that sounds in this conversation, like, you have to be the one that sees the forest for the trees and understands, okay, we love this thing, but you think back as an adult when you were 7 years old. I loved dinosaurs and
Yeah.
cars. Great. They're fun. Enjoy them.
Yeah.
Not a thing I do today has to do with dinosaurs. I don't know what. I just got my car scheduled for service in a couple of days. I have no idea what to do with that thing. Great. It's a car. It's fun. Dinosaurs. I go to museums every so often. No interest in being a paleontologist. So, like,
Yeah.
if I had to be tied to that thing that I had a knack for, or I enjoyed when I was that age, where the hell would I be today? Like, not at all where I was supposed to end up inevitably. So that's my sort of initial soapbox on this whole thing is the adults need to be the adults in the room when it comes to this kind of stuff. I'm curious
Yeah.
kind of what your take is on it.
Yeah. And if you haven't noticed, I always go to anecdotal things that I can pull into any of the topics that we discuss. Um, and anecdotally, I obviously grew up in a sports family where literally all of us were athletes and will always identify as athletes. I have a nephew that is at San Diego right now. He just transferred there. He graduated from Lafayette. He's got 2 years of eligibility left. So he's transferring to San Diego, where he'll get his master's degree. But he plays football there and, super proud of him. And I was always gone as he was growing up. But my brother, his dad, um, was his coach growing up at every level. So I've seen the type of dad that wants the best for his kid and feels that him coaching his son wherever he can, at least until he got to high school, I believe, um, was the best coach for his son, right? Like not privileged enough to be a Deion Sanders where you can continue with your kid throughout his entire life until he goes off to the pros. But I have a brother that has done that, right? And then, I have another brother who has, two kids, a son and a daughter, and they both are athletes. And I was on the phone with him the one day, and the kids had a day off from school. I think it was, it was maybe like a month ago, some holiday or whatever. Um, and I was on the phone with him as he was driving home, and he walks in the house, and the kids are sitting there on iPads, and he says, and today is literally their last day of school. They're in third grade and in fifth grade, and he says to both of them, put the iPads down, go outside. I don't care what you do, but you're not staying in this house all day. Go outside. And it was just like one of those things of remembering how we were raised. Obviously, we didn't have all of these cell phones and stuff like that. We obviously had video games and things that we were tied to, but we also had to go outside in order to have fun. And it was like, all right, you've been playing the game long enough, go outside. I'm tired of hearing you. I don't want to see you, whatever else. And that was what it kind of reminded me of was how we grew up. And he is also a football coach for his son, but only because they asked him to be. It wasn't like I want to do this. He actually was completely against it, right? So like when I think of helicopter parents, I think of my own parents, I think of my siblings, my sister. I can remember my sister when her son was little, and he was wrestling and playing football and baseball, and she comes and says to me, and why don't you show him stuff? Why don't you take him out in the yard and show him things for football, or go into the basement and roll out the mat and show him wrestling moves? And I'm like, I am not showing him anything until he comes to me and says he wants me to show it to him. Forcing any of my knowledge onto him at any point is stupid if he's not asking for it. It's starting to make him think that this is how our relationship will be. And that's not what I want. I want him to be able to come to me with literally anything. If sports is what we talk about, then sports is what we talk about, but it doesn't have to be that, right? And I didn't want to assign that kind of value to it. So, like I said, my family is obviously a very large athletic family, and it's what we've always done, and it's how we've communicated. But as we've gotten older, that obviously changes, but like that is kind of the first introduction that we have to each other, is watching, my cousin win all these district track titles and all these state track titles, and, watching my uncle box and, become the heavyweight champ of the world, and, watching my brother on the football field or on the track, or, all of these things all circulate around sports. And at no point do I remember my dad saying, or my uncle for that matter, who was a professional athlete, ever saying, I know better than your coach. Come over here and we will do XYZ, and I will really truly show you this, that, and whatever. It was us seeking it out because they wanted to see from us that we were invested in it. And I feel like today, that's probably a long walk for a short drink of water, but I feel like today parents are saying, I want to be able to have something with my son or daughter, and I'm going to put them in sports, and I'm going to make them do it because all the things that I was taught growing up are, they all came from me being on the field. They all came from me, being with my teammates. And while that may be true, and while it is I will always say that sports is a great foundation for life and perseverance and loss and ups and downs and handling emotions and everything else, it may not be the best avenue for every kid. But there are a number of parents who think that their kids need the experience that they had, and it doesn't always, or an experience that they didn't have, where they start to, as I said, 6-year-old in a transfer portal. Where's he transferring to? From the swings to the teeter totter? Like where's the kid transferring to? Like is he just going to be over here on the slide instead of, over, on the basketball court shooting baskets? Like what is it? Right. So the things that parents are trying to inject into their kids' athletic understanding, or at least their kids' athletic experience, it's know when to do these things. And I'm not a parent. I'm not going to sit here and tell you how to parent your kid or anything else, even though it may sound like that from me using my anecdotal experience. But when you truly look at how kids get burned out, or how kids just say, I don't really want it anymore, or the parents that are yelling at the ump. One of my favorite video clips is the ump that cancels the baseball game, the Little League baseball game, because the parents are yelling at him, and they ask him, do you feel like a big man now? And he's like, no, do you feel big? You just ruined this for your kid. And it's just like, more umps and more refs need to take that control, because parents, like I said, they're trying to inject an experience into their kids' lives that they either had or that they didn't have, instead of just supporting them and saying, you can be a high level athlete. And when you put in the work, you can do some very great things. I was fortunate enough to play college football. There's a very small margin of people that can do that at any level. You were fortunate enough to be on a pitcher's mound on a Division I baseball field. Very small margin of people can say that, but it didn't come from parents that just wanted to inject themselves into every aspect of your sports life. So while I'm sure there are going to be a number of kids that can pan out from the helicopter parent, there's probably even more that pan out because they fall in love with sports and realize that it takes hard work to get there, and they seek the help and support to get it there. Not the parent saying, hey, my kid is good, I'm going to get him a trainer, we're going to do extra laps, we're going to do extra push-ups, we're going to do extra this or extra that. Allow the kid to fall in love with the sport, and he'll seek that out, she'll seek that out. and the proof is there. I mean, you don't hear a lot of players saying, "Yeah, my dad was the roughest on me as a 5 year old." No, you don't see that, right? So, I'm sure that things that I've probably said can anger people, whatever else, but like the more you allow kids to just be kids and fall in love with sports and fall in love with the things that they experience and have true experiences, certainly manicure them, protect them, give them the things that they didn't have, but also remember you don't have to just like hover and just inject yourself into everything. There's something to be said for the fact that growing up, our parents didn't know where we were for most of the day. We didn't have cell phones and we didn't have communication to do all of those things. We were able to experience things and we turned out, just fine in that regard.
Yeah, I think, I mean, second everything that you've said, and the one thing I'll add based on kind of your anecdote is when I meet with families for, on the academy side and
Mm-hmm.
help through the admissions process and the recruiting process and things like that, the most interesting sort of interaction that I ever have with parents is we'll start talking about, okay, here are the things that we need to do to get your recruiting materials set up. Here's, what we're going to do to kind of set up your preferences to understand what that list looks like. Here's what we're going to do. You start to kind of take them through what this looks like to really lean in to
Mm-hmm.
this recruiting process and lean into this college process. And inevitably, parents ask the question for in that first meeting that they're a part of, okay, what do I need to do? What do I need to do? And the answer is always the same, nothing. You need to do nothing. And it's actually very important that you do nothing.
Yeah.
And it's always interesting to see the responses or reactions or facial expressions from parents in that space. I think it's a varying level of responses, and I think so much of it stems from why they came and found us in the first place. It stems from their own sort of fears and anxieties about this stuff. And I get it. Like you're choosing to entrust your kid to somebody who isn't you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I completely empathize with how that feels and what that commitment looks like. But I do think sometimes that trepidation stems more from, oh shoot, if I'm not the one rowing this boat forward, what's actually going to end up happening? Did I
Yeah.
spend the
How are we gonna
first
get to
fit?
shore?
Yeah, like did I spend the first 15 years of this kid's life trying to get him to X school or Y program or whatever it is or her? And I think a lot of parents are scared to see what actually comes out of the end of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that because you probably had an expectation of what that was going to look like at a certain point when you started working with your kids. But at the end of the day, man, like there's got to be a level of trust and lean in on that of just like your kid's your kid. Like if they don't want to do this and they're not motivated to get this done, like you can't will them to that. When they get to
Yeah.
college, you're not there. Like they have to show up to practice on their own. They have to balance school and sport on their own. They have to get their stuff done. They have to do that's them, man. So like if they can't do this part, which I would argue is kind of the most fun out of all of it, where you get to see all your options and explore all your things and test the waters and put your best foot forward. If this isn't the part that you can get motivated about, you and I both can speak to the fact that at 5 in the morning when a coach is banging on your door and telling you to get your butt to the weight room to do something you don't want to do, that's that's not the that's the hard part when you
Yeah.
get there and you start doing that. So it's interesting. I wish more parents were more comfortable in that conversation, just saying, okay, great. That's at this stage of life, that's where I'm supposed to be. I'm supposed to step back now and I'm supposed to let my kid sort of blaze the path that they want to then blaze on. I've done what I can do as a parent. So it's 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 interesting.
Certainly is. And the last thing I'll say is for anyone listening or watching or whatever else, go listen to our previous show with Dan Chamberlain, where he gives great insight and great perspective into all of these things as somebody who is um, coaching at that youth level and has been part of a lot of great programs to learn and teach and also be a dad at the same time. And I loved how he said I pay for my kid to lose and to learn how to lose and to learn how to navigate the many facets of sports. not just to be on the best team and be an all-star. That was one of the other things that kind of resonated with me during that conversation. But definitely go listen to it. But as always, we wish that every single kid has a great sports experience. Not everyone is going to. There's going to be ups, downs, bumps in the road, injuries, you name it. It's going to happen. If you play for a long time, as much as you and I played sports, you're going to have bumps, bruises, and injuries. But stay competitive and always put your best foot forward. But we appreciate you guys listening, watching the Athletes podcast. Hopefully you enjoyed the topics that we covered today. Leave a comment and let us know if we said something you agree with, something that you didn't agree with, something that you would like to hear us kind of espouse on or dig into or research or kind of give any other perspective on. But like I said, we appreciate it. Appreciate you guys listening and watching the Athletes podcast. We'll see you again next time.